Milling Through History presents The Peggy Eaton Affair. When it comes to politics, people usually remember scandals very well, and in the case of early American Republic politics, numerous scandals came up, but perhaps one of the most divisive, if not juiciest, was that of the Peggy Eaton Affair. It has also been referred to in history as the Petticoat Affair, namely because this entire scandal centered specifically around a woman, and namely it's just because of who she was. And so it's rather unique to look at, as this would actually change the entire landscape of American politics, namely because, well, primarily of ego. It begins with a woman by the name of Peggy O'Neill, who grew up in Washington, D.C. at her father's boarding house, which was called the Franklin House. Now, what made Peggy a rather unique individual was that she was extremely well educated and oftentimes played the piano at the bar of the boarding house. Now, she was oftentimes seen speaking with a lot of men, and this would actually make her reputation become somewhat scrutinized, as namely because not only did she work at a bar, but all of this attention being brought by older men upon such a young girl seemed rather unladylike. Well, her father was able to prevent her from running off and getting married at a very early age, but in 1816, she would marry John Timberlake, who was actually over 20 years her senior. Now, this individual was rather unique as he was in debt, and the couple found themselves trying to figure out how in the world they were ever going to get rid of all of their newly accumulated married debt and live a proper life for themselves. Enter into this picture a new character, and that was John Eaton of Tennessee. Now, at the time, John Eaton was a senator, and being rather prosperous for himself, he befriended the Timberlakes and would offer to pay off the debt of John Timberlake and also offer to get him a job in the Mediterranean Squadron of the United States Navy. Now, all of these turns of good luck seemed just a little too good to be true, but rumors began to swirl. The reason why John Eaton was trying to help Timberlake out so much was that he wanted Timberlake out of the country. This way, Eaton was able to go after Peggy, and they could have a lurid affair. Well, Timberlake does go off to the Mediterranean Squadron, and rumors swirled that his sudden death was due to suicide, and yet medical examiners stated that he did not die from suicide, but rather had pneumonia. And as such, while certainly medicine proved that Timberlake died of natural causes, the fact remained that there was enough circumstantial evidence to tarnish the reputation of John Eaton and Peggy Timberlake. But then the story takes a rather peculiar twist. The two would find themselves married 9 months after the death of John Timberlake, which was extremely quick for the time. Usually, people would see that widows would remain in a state of mourning for at least a year, if not a little bit longer, before opting to remarry. Suddenly, Peggy Timberlake, now known as Peggy Eaton, was married to a senator who was looked favorably upon by Andrew Jackson, and John Eaton was tapped to become Andrew Jackson's Secretary of War. Being brought into the inner circle, Peggy Eaton was expected to socialize with all the wives of the cabinet. However, the problem was Peggy was never seen by society women as being their equal, namely because Peggy Eaton was not known for keeping to her place, but rather being rather outspoken, willing to speak up at any time, and effectively create waves in the water. Now, the wives of the cabinet were led by Floride Calhoun, the wife of Vice President John C. Calhoun. And she was the one that determined, no, we are not going to involve ourselves with this rather scandalous woman. Now, because of this, word eventually got back to Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson was rather sympathetic towards Peggy Eaton. He believed that she was receiving unfair treatment from society types. The reason for this is because even Jackson's own wife, Rachel Jackson, had been on the receiving end of vicious attacks from the press, and her sudden demise he felt was caused due to these attacks. Having felt such great sympathy for Mrs. Eaton, Jackson told his cabinet that their wives needed to go and have tea with her. Now, the cabinet members were placed into an awkward position. Do they listen to the president and order their wives to go off and have tea with a woman that they feel is not ladylike? Or do they listen to their wives and risk the ire of the president? The only member of the cabinet who had no issue was Martin Van Buren, namely because he was a widower and had really nothing to lose. And so his willingness to go and socialize with Mrs. Eaton gained favor with Andrew Jackson. The rest of the cabinet, though, opted to listen to their wives and chose not to have any part of their family socialize with Mrs. Eaton. This would enrage Jackson, but he could also see that there was new forms of trouble lying off on the horizon. There were those in the Democratic Party who saw John C. Calhoun as being the next president of the United States, and that Andrew Jackson should only be a one-term president. Needing to find a way to effectively get rid of his political rival, Jackson wanted to shake up his entire cabinet and needed to find an excuse to dismiss all of his cabinet members. Knowing that this would be a situation that was occurring, Martin Van Buren opted to resign along with John Eaton, and this gave Jackson the excuse he needed to get rid of all the stalwarts in his cabinet who were supporting Calhoun, effectively isolating his now rebellious vice president and giving him a chance to pack his cabinet with men who would be supporting him. Now, ironically enough, despite all of this, Andrew Jackson would bring back Martin Van Buren, namely because following the entire affair, John C. Calhoun would opt not to become vice president again. This opened the door for Van Buren to step in as the vice president, and after 4 years of being Jackson's VP, he would be elected president of the United States in 1836. For John C. Calhoun, life after the affair proved to be rather different, as his once off dream of presidential ambitions turned him instead into a regional leader, as he was reelected to the Senate from South Carolina, and became one of the most outspoken voices for Southern rights. For John Eaton, his life post-cabinet proved to be a rather unique one, as he would be made the governor of the Florida Territory from 1834 to 1836, and then following that would serve as ambassador to Spain. When he returned home, his time in politics came to an end, as he would re-establish himself in his law office and remain in Washington, D.C. But perhaps the greatest irony of it all is that of Peggy Eaton. Upon the death of her husband, she would wait 3 years before getting married once again to Antonio Boccaccini, who was an Italian music teacher and dancing master that was, ironically enough, at least 35 years younger than Peggy Eaton. She was 59, he was in his mid-20s. In 1866, though, he would take almost all of Peggy's money, and, in addition to this, would take her granddaughter and run off to Europe. Now, when this occurred, Peggy was able to successfully divorce her Italian husband, but she could never regain any of her money. Ironically, her former ex-Italian husband would marry her own granddaughter, and the two would live happily off of Peggy's money for much of their marriage. As for Peggy Eaton, she would never recover anything and would live in a state of poverty in Washington, D.C. for the rest of her life, when she passed away on November the 8th, 1879. Today, she is buried in the Oak Hill Cemetery next to John Eaton. For more information, please consider these suggested titles. Be sure to click on the left-hand side of the screen to subscribe to our show, and on the right-hand side for our latest episode. And we will see you again for the next episode of Milling Through History.